Hello, this is Dr. Angela Byrd-Wright, Division Equity Leader, and I'm glad to be with you all today. As you may be watching this video asynchronously, as you might have missed the live action of our learning session 4B, operationalizing equity, examining fragility, racial equity, and anti-racism, and the collective impact on student achievement and our organizational progress. So our driver, as always, when we have a session together, and that is understanding our key terms and our common language around our equity work and being very specific with such. And so today we'll continue to delve into, as an extension of learning session 4A, those key terms of fragility, power, privilege, racial equity, and anti-racism, and how they're necessary and foundational to equity. And if these areas are not really unpacked and challenged and examined, then our work towards equity can and will be significantly hindered and ineffectual. And that can block our way towards cultural competency, designing and creating culturally proficient spaces, and cultural responsiveness. You might have been wondering, well, why have we spent so long in phase one about onboarding and pre-competence during our learning series so far? And that is the work, is that self-reflection, that critical consciousness, because that is foundational to our work as we build towards cultural competency. Cultural competency is not something that you check off the box and say, oh, I've got cultural competency and I've got that done, and now moving on to the next thing. Cultural competency is something that's ongoing. Developing and creating culturally proficient spaces is an ongoing work. And cultural responsiveness, as we look here on the screen in regard to our core business of teaching and learning and our equity model, surrounded by cultural responsive teaching, leadership, and curriculum. And we'll be unpacking those three areas of our equity model as we go into phase two of our work. But at the core of our business of teaching and learning is self-reflection and self-awareness, and how that can have that true collective impact on student achievement and our organizational progress as a whole. As we then move into learning session or phase two, we'll then get into our safe and nurturing environments, maximizing every child's learning. And again, when we say maximizing every child's learning, we mean every child, every day, whatever it takes. And so this work of unpacking these key terms will be necessary in our work as we drive home our point of critical consciousness, self-reflection, self-awareness through our core business of teaching and learning, and how we can enhance that and do that even better here. So as always, you can select the reflection guide. And so I'll demonstrate that before I go into full screen for today. But you're going to go to your reflection guide here. It will say session 4B, and that's where we're headed today. And for our CIA team. So as we move along, for each of our portions of today's presentation, you'll have the opportunity to follow along with those active links, not only in your reflection guide, but also as you work and follow along with today's video. So I hope you've had the opportunity now to have opened up your reflection guide. That reflection guide is a forced copy that will allow you to type in your thoughts as we move forward. As always, we talk about our shared commitment to brave space. So even if you're watching this asynchronously, you got to be authentic and honest with yourself. And that is understanding that this is a constructive space to share, to disagree, and work together, but a comfortable place to be uncomfortable. And for us to create such a space, we will continue to do our best to be honest, to be thoughtful, reflective, remaining engaged in our process, speaking our truth, understanding that our lived experiences can be different from someone else's, but through that work, we can affirm others and not challenge the ideas or, not challenging people, but maybe challenging ideas in our thinking and our process. And again, that all coalesces around that thought process of self-reflection, self-awareness, and critical consciousness. And as always, whatever you learn here leaves here, goes with you. But whatever you say here, so whatever you're reflecting, anytime you would like to chat with me, always stays confidential and stays with us in this process, because that's our commitment to that brave space where we can open up and have that rich dialogue and conversation and deeper thinking as we move forward in this work around equity. So let's talk about some key constructs, because internalizing those key terms of race, ethnicity, diversity, and culture will launch us into naming some forms of racism, intolerance, discrimination, and inequity in not only our policies, but our practices. And in our previous sessions, we've had the opportunity to discuss those key terms and constructs such as marginalization, discrimination, biases, microaggressions. We also talked about the differences between ethnicity, race, culture, and the like. And so now stepping into understanding and really naming and discussing racism in its many forms, because if we don't speak on it, then we can't correct it. We cannot identify it, own it, or even dismantle it for that matter. And so we would run contrary to who we say we are as a division. So as we explore these key constructs, keep that lens in mind that the topics we're discussing can be hard, can be challenging, can be difficult. And so as we continue to move forward, excuse me, in our discussion, you're going to have different feelings, and that's perfectly fine. That goes back to our commitment to brave space. And it will be important that we continue to hold those norms very dear to the work that we're doing. So let's talk about racism and define that key construct. And that involves one group having the power to carry out systemic discrimination through the institutional policies and practices of the society and shaping those cultural beliefs and the values that support those racist policies and practices. Systemic racism is organizational in scope and culture and policies, directives and practices, and or procedures that can exclude, that can displace or marginalize, which is why we talked about marginalization, some racialized groups, or create unfair advantages or barriers for them to access valuable benefits or opportunities, which is why we continue to focus on access, opportunities, supports, and outcomes. And then that idea of being colorblind, if you can recall from learning session 3, when we began to unpeel those layers of critical consciousness, we talked about one of those false narratives of being colorblind and this approach that can essentially deny those subtle forms of discrimination that have replaced the blatant or explicit racism, which if you look above there on our screen, of the past. And so the colorblind approach can ignore evidence that skin color can play a powerful role in shaping an individual's life or experiences. So what are some common myths about race and racism? And we touched on this in a few sessions back, but race is biological. That's a myth, where the fact being that race is a social construct. The myth that race used to be a problem, but the past is the past. Well, in fact, that many explicitly racist laws have now been overturned in the United States. The effects have still cascaded and are systemic and current realities and structural for many, and can still be a pervasive force for many. The myth of good life outcomes are based on hard work and good values. That goes back to our myth of meritocracy, or those 4 horsemen of deficit mindset. We talked about that and making that connection to learning session 3, but also in learning session 4A. And so what's the fact? That hard work and individual success are common values in American culture, but hard work isn't always enough to overcome historical and current structural racism, or the myth, just as we talked about before, I don't see color. Although color blindness is well-intentioned in most cases, it is not possible, and attempting it is harmful and not helpful. Meaning that you might not see me, you might not see or value me when you say I do not see color. And ethnically or racially marginalized groups may have that perception. So you remember these guys, the monsters of Assumicide. And so we talked about them in connection to learning session 4A with those deficit mindsets, but keep those in mind because some of those assumptions can really be tied into those myths about race and racism, and then can lend itself to deficit mindset or deficit thinking. So let's examine some key constructs of fragility, privilege, and power. Fragility meaning those feelings of discomfort when a person can experience or witness discussions around racial inequities or inequalities and injustice. And these can manifest in multiple ways. And here are just a few: tears, avoidance, anger, defensiveness, or denial. And hand in hand with that is privilege and power. Privilege being the resulting power brought on by it and justified again by that myth of meritocracy. If I just work hard enough, if I just have the right grit, but then privilege could be viewed as a built-in advantage that's really separate from one's level of income or efforts, while having greater access, greater ability to have power and resources other than others in the same situation. So on your own, you have access to this presentation, which is found in our Equity Google Classroom. I want you to take a moment to look at the video entitled Silent Beats. After doing so, you'll have the opportunity to then answer on your reflection guide. What are those key constructs that you recognize in this video? What narratives were shown? What perspectives, biases, misinformation, or assumptions were communicated? And then you might be asking, what's that last question about? Well, how was tap dancing used to convey meaning? You'll see this in this particular video as it is nonverbal. And so we're going to be examining in this video in Silent Beats external factors that we can see of those constructs of race, racism, systemic racism, that color blindness, but also fragility, power, and privilege. This will be a great time now to pause the video, access the presentation, go to this particular slide, and you're going to press play to watch the Silent Beats video. We'll come back on the other side and we'll continue on with our presentation. So now will be a great time to pause the video. Welcome back. I hope you've had the opportunity to think through what you saw as far as the key constructs that you recognize, the narratives shown, perspectives at all in regard to silent beats, and then how tap dancing was used to convey meaning. But what if we can't see it? Skin color, ethnicity, race, we can, in most cases, physically see. It's the physical aspects or appearance that we can see. But let's talk about another marginalized group that also experiences some structural issues or concerns that can be factored in with privilege or power as well. And that can be detrimental, in fact. And so one of our key understandings is that of our LGBTQ plus community. You may also have heard it referenced as LGBTQIA, with that acronym standing for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning, intersex, and asexual. It is very common for LGBTQIA people in the United States to encounter discrimination and bias in response to their sexual orientation and or gender identity. Young people can face these negative consequences for identifying or being perceived as LGBTQIA beginning as early as elementary school. So to feel safe and to feel seen, to be valued, and to feel capable of growth are some simple concepts or basic pillars of student achievement and the results of good pedagogy. But for many students, or adults for that matter, within this community, these rights can really remain out of reach. With that lens in mind, we're going to reflect and connect again. In this instance, you'll see the question posed here, but what if we can't see it? You'll have the opportunity again in your reflection guide to hone in on those key constructs that you recognize, narratives that were shown, perspectives, biases, and misinformation, and how personal narratives in this instance have been used to create a deeper sense of understanding of identity. So likewise with the first reflect and connect, you'll have the opportunity to stop, pause and think. And as you go through, to answer the questions on your reflection guide. We'll meet back on the other side of this video and your time to reflect as we then will proceed on in today's presentation. This will be a good time now to pause the video. Welcome back. I hope that you've had the opportunity as well to reflect on our other section there in regards to our LGBTQIA or LGBTQ plus community, and really have some thoughtful dialogue. You may be watching this video maybe with another person that was unable to attend our last meeting together or a small group, and to delve into those conversations. And so now we're going to make that connection between our last learning session A to this portion of our learning session B, and really capitalize on understanding the two quotes that were shared in our book study that we're undergoing now, Culture Responsive Teaching and the Brain. And so I want you to think on these two quotes that have been provided. The real voyage of discovery consists in not seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. The second being, when I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid. So I'd like you to consider, as you look on your reflection guide, what's one thing over the course now of our time together, since the beginning of the year and engaging in these types of conversations, what's one thing that might have challenged you to have some new eyes? Or you can respond to the prompt of, I recognize that I have strength in the service of. So what does that mean then to you? This will be a good time now to pause the video and we'll meet right back. Welcome back. I hope you've had the opportunity to engage in some deep thought on your own to connect the quote that you had around thinking about these two sentence stems about one thing that challenged you to have some new eyes and recognizing that you have the strength in the service of. So what does that mean as we move forward? I want to bring your attention back to our text in one of the quotes here about being responsive to diverse student and adult needs. What does that mean? Remember when we talked about in one of our previous learning sessions 1 and 2, about hashtag we are HCS. So what does that mean for your role, for whom you serve, your team, the families that you work with? So being responsive to diverse student and adult needs really ask us to dig in and to be mindful and present. and that requires reflection. And engaging in reflections helps culturally responsive practitioners to recognize the beliefs, behaviors, and practices that get in the way of their ability to respond constructively and positively. So I go back to my question earlier, why are we still in pre-competence and understanding and onboarding and that reflection piece? Because cultural responsive practices hinges on being mindful, being present, and requires reflection. Because this will help us then to recognize our beliefs, our practices, and our behaviors. And this is why we have to apply that critical consciousness that can get in the way of us navigating and responding appropriately and constructively as we work with diverse student and adult needs. So as we dig into one of our key terms on racial equity, so we talked about race, we talked about racism, so now let's talk about racial equity. And that's the systemic fair treatment of people of all races, resulting in equitable opportunities and outcomes for all, with a deliberate system and support approach to achieve and sustain racial equity. And perspectives of racial equity hinge on our identity, our diversity, perspectives, and the recognition of the existence of bias. Here and again, you can see how that foundational understanding of those key terms from our previous sessions help us to operationalize and understand why we are now having a discussion about racial equity as well. So additional key constructs to keep in mind and to understand is not unracism, non-racism, is anti-racism, which is a conscious decision. It's a choice, a conscious decision to engage and to make frequent, consistent, equitable choices daily. And these choices regard, here we go, ongoing self-reflection and self-awareness. Being an anti-racist educator then, and again, going back to that cultural responsive practices, is understanding that we must be lifelong learners. Goes back to my point from the earlier portion of today, when I said that we're not just checking it off the box. This is an ongoing process, a lifelong process, believing in the power of developing a critical consciousness, which comes from our reading, our studying, our understanding, our scholarship, from humility, from listening and engaging with others, and consistently examining and re-examining our own ideas, beliefs, and our truths. So we have to go back to Hammond's work and thinking about your responses to those personal reflection questions and those questions that challenged you. And as we begin to transition from self-reflection to self-awareness, that application of critical consciousness to cultural competency through culturally responsive practices, we understand that the work is ongoing. In fact, Hammond says in her work on page 53 that cultural competence and responsiveness comes from being comfortable in your own skin, because you're not a neutral party in the process. You can never take yourself out of the equation. Instead, you must commit to the journey. And therefore, how we move forward is highly dependent on having the right mindset, inclusive of engaging in continual mindset checks for implicit bias, microaggressive behaviors, and understanding that our emotional intelligence is just as important as our intellectual ability. And so we're hardwired and ruled by the amygdala and the reticular activating system that is designed to keep us safe. And so you got to watch out for those dragons, because our brain works first to keep us safe and surrounded by our moat of implicit bias. And then dragon number 2, the brain will try some scare tactics. Physically, the physicality of it all. The cortisol and the adrenaline get going, and we can short circuit our rational thought process. And that can either put you in flight, fright, or freeze mode when you're outside and operating outside of your comfort zone. Dragon 3, keeping you in check with false narratives like color blindness, not calling attention to differences in race or culture or language. Or dragon number 4, we grow impatient. I don't have a culture. I already know this because, or you may say, I know this because I'm a person of color, or if I say this, someone's going to think I'm X. And so we've got to learn then how to slay a dragon all day. Well, how do we do that? We have to intentionally commit to that ongoing self-awareness and reflection. And this is done through our examination of our cultural identity. So how can we do that? Understanding our cultural frame of reference, widening our cultural lens, identify what are those key triggers. Because again, our work to keep us safe will defend us at any cost. So it gears our minds up. So we've got to be comfortable to protect ourselves, and then practicing that emotional self-management as well. So we've got to learn how to slay a dragon all day. So if we know the dragon is coming for us, we've got to know then how to answer our door. And so Hammond provides 5 elements of interaction that can activate our RAS system for either rewards or threats and influence how we can react or interact in given situations. Those 5 elements are standing, certainty, control, connections, and equity. And so in your presentation is a link. You'll see it there in purple. And what I'd like you to do is to click on that link, and it's going to take us to page 65 of our book study, those social interaction elements that can activate those threats in the brain, and recognizing what are our common triggers. So I want you to take a moment to begin on page 65, or if you have the hard copy of the text with you. And I'd like you to refer to this particular section as well as figure 4.3. You're going to see each element, a description, and what the threat can pose to you. Take a few minutes to read through all 5, and then thinking through which one of those dragons could be coming for me. And how do I know how to answer my door? By really identifying what are those elements, that social interaction elements that can activate my threats in the brain. And then that's going to help you to learn how, well, what can I better apply that critical consciousness when I'm thinking through my self-awareness, my self-reflection as I respond in a culturally responsive way. So take for just a few minutes to read through each of the areas there. And then we're going to meet back on the other side as we conclude our conversation today. This will be a great time now to pause the video. Welcome back. I hope you've had the opportunity now to understand one of those 5 elements and how it plays a factor and impacts your work or role, or how you may interact with your team. I want to bring us back here as we begin to wrap up for today about our communities of practice, because communities of practice, we talked about allowing us to use that, describing what those practices are, interrogating the practice, confronting that practice, and then reconstructing the narrative. Well, communities of practice allow us to do just that, where we're engaged together in that collective learning process. And also it can be a powerful setting for engaging in critical consciousness. So again, this work can be messy. It's going to be complicated and hard. And It allows us, though, to go deeper with our self-reflection and awareness. And this is a connection from our previous session because it takes a community of practice that's consistent in engaging in critical consciousness, and that allows us to open our doors of authenticity as we begin to engage in the work around culturally responsive practice, and then making space for that critical reflection. So without our critical examination of our thinking, our practices, or our systems, we're bound to stay stuck in those technical and procedural shifts instead of making that transformative change for education equity. So at this time, we have, over the course of 4 months now, engaged in that process of onboarding and pre-competence. And we will be launching into phase 2 with cultural competency and culturally proficient spaces. And so we've set the foundation for that work. And again, it's ongoing. And so I invite you now, prior to our next session, to complete your self-paced work. And so that you can complete that for session 4B. Should you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'll be happy to assist you. As always, I want to thank you for your time, your commitment, and your energy towards this work. Bye-bye.